right, let's get started with this week's edition of The Public Square. I'm Wayne Shepherd. All the usual suspects are here today. Dave Zanotti, Rob Walgate, Melanie Elsey, Jeff Sanders, Alan C. Duncan is here, as well as our producer. And at the microphone, he has a double role here in the program. Alan, we're thankful for you. Hey, let's talk about what's ahead today, Dave.
Well, we want to talk about the MAGA Court. That's a word that seldom gets uttered here on the Public Square, the MAGA word. Because when everybody else is talking about something, we find something else to talk about usually.
We like to go the other way, don't we?
Yeah, it's kind of our strategy. I taught my kids always when when you see a crowd moving in one direction, just start walking the other way. It's the smartest way to live. And so we tend to stay off the herd mentality kind of broadcast. But this one is out and it's early. And we've been talking about this in different pieces and places for a while. So let's get on to the question of the MAGA Court. Now, let's set up a definition. The MAGA Court is a term that's being used by opponents of the existing Supreme Court, and it's the name-calling game that we've all become so familiar with now. And none of us are guiltless. I am guilty of trying to package things in a way so that the name connotes some kind of message. And I'm sure I've had some names that weren't fair over the years that I've used, et cetera, et cetera. So the whole concept of naming something in a pejorative fashion, this is what the other side's doing here. And again, I'm saying no one's innocent of that, but we're trying really hard here to stop doing that. So it's their invention, not ours. The MAGA Court is the existing Supreme Court. It's been deemed that way by people who support the Biden administration and the progressive left. Now, the Biden administration is not a pejorative. Biden is the president. Administration is a neutral word. And the progressive left is not a term I'm casting on them. It's the term that they use for themselves. Okay, so I'm trying to be non-hypocritical here, trying to be straight up on this.
Okay, so far so good.
So far we're okay, like checking the language. And the idea, of course, is that the MAGA Court is an illegitimate court. It's a court that Donald Trump set in place. And by so doing, it exists now to do the bidding of Donald Trump, whether Donald Trump's president of the United States or not. Now, that's the premise of where the whole thing establishes. So maybe the first thing we should ask ourselves is it possible that that's an overextension of reality when we consider the names of the people who are on the Supreme Court? Should we start with John Roberts?
Well, okay. First of all, they're calling it the MAGA Court as though it is Donald Trump's court.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to follow Donald Trump, and that most of them are appointed by Donald Trump. Only 3 of the 6 so-called conservatives.
3 of the 9 in total were appointed by Trump.
And John Roberts was not appointed by Donald Trump, and I would not classify him as a conservative, or at least as a consistent conservative. You have Sam Alito.
And so if he's not a consistent conservative, he's certainly not MAGA.
Absolutely not MAGA.
And, by the way, he's the Chief Justice, right?
And he was trying hard. He was trying hard not to overthrow Roe versus Wade last year.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have Sam Alito, who was appointed by W. Bush, right? Okay. Mm-hmm. And then you have Clarence Thomas, who was appointed under the Reagan administration 30 years ago. So none of those people were appointed by Donald Trump. And then even of the Donald Trump appointees, they have not been consistent in upholding everything Donald Trump wanted. So I know why they're calling it the MAGA Court, but it's not consistent.
Well, and that terminology also implies that Donald Trump picked those names out of a hat, or that he thought of them in a vacuum all by himself. He gave a list of about 11 or so.
Wasn't that fascinating? 25 justices. The list had 25 names on it.
And he said, hey, I'm picking them off
before
of this
he was elected.
List. Yeah, and that's why many people did vote for him. But he didn't make up that list in a vacuum just on his own. He was talking with other groups that were advising him.
I just think it's interesting because anytime President Trump's name is mentioned on the program, we're going to get emails asking us why we spend so much time bashing Donald Trump. And then we're going to get emails that ask us why we spend so much time putting Donald Trump on a pedestal. And they're going to be about the same program.
But what's interesting is we haven't had any commentary from listeners about Donald Trump for a long time because we haven't been talking about him. And it's not like that's the focus. But this is a legitimate story. It's a very, very important story. And it is being presented, again, by the progressive left saying that the court's a MAGA court. Now, By the way, did you all notice that John Roberts never did find who made the leak?
Wait, John Roberts didn't find who made the leak, or John Roberts didn't publicly share who made the leak?
Or John Roberts didn't look for who made the leak.
Okay.
That doesn't surprise me, knowing Washington, D.C.
Okay, because remember, that was like the gigantic controversy, and it was a big, big deal. It never happened before, and it created huge havoc in the entire conversation across the country. And yet they were certain they were going to find this person that had broken every. We just like kind of just disappeared and went away. John Roberts never found the person that leaked the Alito decision on Roe.
When I read about that and how many drafts change hands and they're sending opinions around behind the scenes, it probably is a bit remarkable. It hasn't happened
more often.
It hasn't happened more often than what it has, because when you think of the number of people that have seen it, you think, I'm not here to bash young people, but when you think of the younger folks that are reading it, they tend to be a bit more emotional and less mature in thinking about the consequences that come with something that it wasn't forwarded to someone it shouldn't have been forwarded.
Yeah, because
to.
a lot of the folks that are working at the court are younger and don't understand. They're young in their careers, so they could perhaps, but they haven't for years. No one's ever made that mistake before.
No, they haven't. But now we're dealing with a generation who send and forward far too many pictures and notes.
Yeah, but at the same time, for all we know, it might have been one of the justices that leaked it.
It could have been.
It might one of the old justices that did it.
It could have been. Yeah, we don't know.
So the first point is it's not a court dominated by Trump appointees. Number one. Number two, the people who aren't Trump appointees are all over the board on all kinds of issues. Of course, and number three, it's kind of hard for me to imagine John Roberts, let alone Clarence Thomas, towing the line for anybody other than what they think, because they have a reputation as being fiercely independent. So, okay, but it serves the purpose to brand the court as the MAGA court, because that's supposed to be a pejorative, and that's supposed to persuade people that there's something wrong at the Supreme Court. Now, let's talk about the role of the court in regards to the country. We've talked, Rob, you've probably said it best, that you defined American jurisprudence as waiting every June and every October for the Supreme Court to tell everyone else in the country what the law is.
9 people in black robes telling us what laws are.
Actually, 5 people in black robes will determine what the laws
They'll determine what that's even scarier, isn't it?
Yeah.
True.
And so we've got a situation where we have talked about the outsized role of the court that actually is unconstitutional, if you understand the document in its full context. The Supreme Court is created in Article 3 of the Constitution. Article 3 is the smallest of the 3 articles in regards to the construction of the form of the government. Think about it. First, we had to elect a Congress. That was Article 1. Then the Congress had to help America elect a president. That was Article 2. Then the president had to appoint the justices of the Supreme Court to be ratified by the Congress. That was created in Article 1, and that court became Article 3. There's an order and a sequence and a design to the construction of our country. And without a doubt, the framers understood that the court should be the weakest of the branches. This is something we need to talk about, and we probably can't say it enough because there's so many new listeners to this broadcast, and we thank God for every one of them. We're trying to be full disclosure here. We do not believe the Constitution established 3 equal branches of government, because the people that wrote it didn't write it that way. They considered Congress to be the vortex of power. Congress was the most powerful branch. That was the lawmaking branch. The executive was designed for basically the administration of what Congress said to be done, that was the point. And then, of course, the commander-in-chief.
To execute the law. That's the executive branch, to carry it out.
And the Supreme Court existed to settle conflicts between the states and other points of original jurisdiction, but it wasn't designed. The Constitution doesn't say the Supreme Court every June and October will tell us what the law says. That's not what the Constitution says.
And it also doesn't say that it should be a political arm of either of the parties. Right. And unfortunately, I think that's how it's been viewed as of late.
Now, we are consistent on this. You can go back and listen to broadcasts in our archive. You can go back 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and you will find we have always been saying the same thing. that the Supreme Court has a far outsized value and voice in the determinative process of what federal law should be. We've been saying it from the beginning. And the reason is simple. It's not the reason most people think. The reason that the court has an outsized influence is because Congress has given them the power by default. Congress has been ducking the tough issues of public policy in this country for a generation at least. And every time Congress ducks their responsibility to tell us what exactly the law is and what the consequences are going to be, then the Supreme Court finds some way through some form of litigation to be in a position where they end up making those decisions. The Supreme Court has been incredibly creative, far outside the boundaries of constitutionalism, of original language and original design of the document. And so the Supreme Court has basically moved into the gap, and Congress has not fought back and held the court responsible, even in battling the court. Now, there is a place in our form of civil government for pushback against the court. It's in Congress. Let's say that Congress passes the law and the Supreme Court says that's unconstitutional in our opinion, and they, quote, strike down the law. All right?
Okay.
Congress can pass another law the very next day.
And say, you're overruled by us. And we've just limited your jurisdiction. It extends to the doors of your office, and that's it. And you can't touch this law, and the Supreme Court can't touch it.
The Constitution guarantees that Congress has the authority to limit the jurisdiction. That was key in what you just said. Mm-hmm. They could, on a subject, they could pass a law, like on marriage, and say this shall not be within the jurisdiction of the federal courts.
Did you, listening on the radio, know that? You're never supposed to talk to the listeners in Radio Land, right? Oh, I'm just asking. Everyone listening right now, did you know that? Did you know that the Constitution gives Congress the authority to limit the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court? Well,
and they can impeach justices, too.
It does.
Let me break in so we can take a break here because we are off and running today on a really important topic. So you're going to want to stay tuned and hear the rest of this coming up on the Public Square. Back with you on the Public Square today, talking about maybe we need a question mark after this title, the MAGA Court.
Oh,
because
nice.
The MAGA Court is what the progressive wants to call it. So that's our theme today here in the Public Square. Rob?
We talked about in segment one the ability for Congress to restrict the court, but it seems to me that during campaign season or even on speeches from the floor of the House or the Senate, instead of restricting the court or limiting the court, they offer blame and say, they kind of throw their hands in the air and say, well, we can't do it because look what the court did. They offer the court as the scapegoat for not having to do the hard work. Well, can't do anything about that. Look what the court decided. Wait a minute here. That's Article 3, not Article 1.
Yeah, and unless someone thinks that that's like, oh, those are the bad Democrats doing that. No. The Republicans played that dance the whole way through the marriage debate, and Scalia kept tracking him on it. And that's exactly what happened. So much so that when George Bush was reelected in 2004, promises were made that there would be a marriage amendment brought before the House and the Senate as the first order of business. Karl Rove made that promise to people.
I heard George Bush say it himself. Yeah. I was standing right in front of him when he said it.
And then what ended up happening was come January, right around inauguration time, Rove showed up on a morning news Sunday, I think it was a weekend Sunday news broadcast, and basically explained, we're going to wait to see what the court does before we move to a vote. We're going to wait to see what the court does.
They lied? They lied to us? No.
So they changed their mind and used the court as a deferral. Okay, so the premise on the board today is now the progressive left is very much upset with this court, and they are making suggestions that the president, this is the two legal professors came out basically challenging this as a MAGA court and saying that what the Biden administration now should do, what they must do, is the Biden administration should tell the court no. That where the Biden administration, and President Biden has said this is not a normal court. This is not a usual court. He's used terms of basically saying this is not the way the Supreme Court's supposed to act. So these two professors called the bluff on that line and basically said, okay, Mr. President, what we're suggesting you do is to say it out loud and then to decide through administrative, executive orders and authority to simply not implement what the court says.
And the left is constantly screaming about dictators and fascists. Wouldn't that exactly be what a dictator and a fascist would be? Because I know many people are upset with the court and how they came down on the student loan forgiveness plan. So here's a simple answer. We said Congress can pass a law. Go to the House, go to the Senate, tell them pass the law that forgives all this student loan.
Harvard law professor Mark Tushnet and San Francisco State University political science Aaron Belkin penned an open letter to the Biden administration on popular constitutionalism. This is the news report. This is how it's been reported in multiple media sites because Biden has already said this is, quote, not a normal court. And part of the letter reads in part, we urge President Biden to restrain MAGA justices immediately by announcing that if and when they issue rulings that are based on gravely mistaken interpretations of the Constitution that undermine our most fundamental commitments, the administration will be guided by its own constitutional interpretations.
Yeah.
So the administration becomes its own Supreme Court.
Yeah. Which is what they do with the student loan thing. They said, well, the Supreme Court ruled, and we're not going to go by it.
Now, here's the thing about the left that's interesting to watch. They will use whatever portion of the American government to get their way that suits their purpose and the time and the season. Logical consistency or ethical consistency has nothing to do with it. Wherever they feel you can poke the system, because the system is set up on separation of powers and checks and balances, they will move to that point to get their way. So if they need something out of Congress, Congress is the most important person, a group of people in the world, that's the way it should be. If they need a court ruling, the Supreme Court's the most important group of people in the world, and we have to take care of the Supreme Court. If they need to move to the states, or if they need the president to do something, then they're all for executive orders. The court and Supreme Court be you-know-what. All right, and if they need to go to the states, then they'll go ahead and start something in this. And you know what? They will go the whole way down to the county, to the city, to the local prosecutor. To get their way, they will exploit any part of the system to find a gap in the power curve to get their way. They are, and it doesn't matter what argument they made 2 years ago, they'll make exactly the opposite argument in another venue to get what they want. There is no logical constitutional consistency in the analysis and the functioning of the left. It's whatever works. Pragmatism is always the rule of the day. So right now, and the reason I say that is because when they had a pro-Roe versus Wade court, for 50 years, the court was supreme.
Law of the land.
The law of the land
Settled
was the court.
law.
Settled law.
Everything is settled
everything was
law.
settled law. The precedents could not be touched. Now we're basically telling the president, tell the court to take a hike, jump off a bridge, and do what you want because you don't disagree with them. I mean, it's complete, absolute, total hypocrisy. And they say, well, now, wait a minute. As soon as you say that, again, you can't have hypocrisy as a charge claimed against the progressive left because their job is to change their story every single day because they wake up in a new world because it's an evolutionary curve and they're smarter today than they were yesterday. So you can't hold them to hypocrisy because they make it up as they go along and they don't believe in absolute truth. So we have to find another word for hypocrisy. Let's just say it's the grossest inconsistency. There's no logical integrity to it, and they change to get whatever they want, however they want. Maybe we should call it the adolescent strategy. In fact, I've got some really, really effective grandchildren. They're not even anywhere near adolescents yet. They can switch on a dime and get you going one way or the other for what they really want in the end. I mean, there we go.
Well, and conservatives do this too. You know, the Republican Party. The Republican Party does as well. It's more of the character of the person and the character of that team that's doing it, I think.
Well, I would certainly say the parties will go whichever way they want to go.
Strategy
yes.
of both sides.
Yeah, it's just playing chess. It's not. There's no moral foundation. We're just playing chess.
Okay, so that's fair. That's a fair edit. So it's not just the progressive left that does it. It's the entire power curve.
Yeah, we got a couple of ballot issues in Ohio that we could talk about. But if you've listened to any of our previous programming,
now that you mention it, yes. Yeah, which we've been pretty careful to make sure that the nation knew what was going on. There's more to come on that story as well, since you mentioned it, but not today. Okay, so Rob, you look like you were...
No, I'm just thinking as well, it's always referred to as of late as the MAGA Court, and they call it illegitimate court because of the way of the last nomination to the court with Justice Barrett and her addition. The fact that in a previous administration, Republicans had said, we're going to wait till after the election until now. But I think a lot of facts are left out there. One is,
I don't know. It looks like hypocrisy to me.
Yeah, it does. But I will say, in that instance, I can't believe I'm going to say this and stick up for the Republicans, is the fact that the Republicans had control of the Senate both times. The Republicans weren't going to allow a appointee from President Obama through no matter what, because the Republicans were in charge of the Senate. Had the Democrats been in charge of the Senate, they would have been able to do nothing to stop them. That's exactly what happened when the nomination came up of Justice Barrett. The Republicans still had control of the Senate, and they were able to say, hey, we're going to put this through. They both played the game.
I got it.
Amongst the rules.
In other words, when it came to Merrick Garland, whether he was nominated or seated for hearings, it didn't make any difference.
They should have had a vote on him.
other words,
I agree they should have had a vote.
He wasn't going to get it anyway.
But they should have had the vote.
They should have had the vote. Yeah.
The Senate has the right to do that
They do.
if they want to, constitutional, correct?
Constitutionally.
Now, ethically, it would have been smarter to have had a vote
I
and
agree
just
with
go
that.
ahead.
They should have had the vote on him, an up-down vote, and made people stand by that vote instead of Mitch McConnell delaying
Now, sorry, I guess a question to everybody. Knowing now what we know about Merrick Garland,
Oh, Lord.
how do you feel
The whole
about
country
what
dodged a
would
bullet.
have Okay, all right, there you
Oh,
go.
my goodness.
If he had been a Supreme Court justice, all right, what would happen? So
Well, we would all be on
and-
his
and-
list as domestic terrorists,
Well,
probably.
and what we're seeing here is a situation where Merrick Garland is now in a position of extraordinary exposure in regards to questions of ethical, legal processes.
And I feel like he's in a position where he is picking the winners and the losers. I can't imagine how he would have exploited the position on the court to pick winners and losers that would have had no justification in law.
So we can say this for certain. Now, we've got more to say about this for sure. In fact, we're going to challenge this whole premise. I'll give everybody a warm-up. You can get to your notes and to your internet. We got a couple of seconds before the break. Warm up on this one. The reality is that maybe these professors that were writing all of this, maybe they were reading Abraham Lincoln, and maybe they're following the thoughts of Lincoln prior to the Civil War. Maybe that's what it's really all about. So, all right, Wayne, we got to go to break. Why don't you remind people that they're still willing to listen to this bunch of people on the radio, how they can find us?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. I was thinking about the fact that, we have a program that's nearly an hour long, and we realize you can't always listen to the whole hour at once. That's why we have the app, the free smartphone app, The Public Square. That's why we stream this program at our website, thepublicsquare.com. You can go back and listen anytime. So just make put a little marker here if you have to leave us at this time. But of course, we don't want you to leave.
Sorry, Wayne, how long does it take to download the app? Any idea?
Oh my goodness, it can't take more than a few seconds. Right?
It's about 3 button clicks to get to the app to be able to listen to this broadcast anywhere, anytime. Now,
and it's free of charge. Free of charge. And we don't track you on the app. I mean, we're not there to mine the information at all. So
no, we don't track anybody on anything that we do at the American Policy Roundtable or the Public Square, and we're very careful about that. And we're also incredibly appreciative of every station that carries this broadcast coast to coast, and we really do. Thank you to the stations and the people who support those stations, and to the satellite the system why it's downloaded. Everyone that's got anything to do at all with the Public Square and the distribution of this broadcast, we are in a position of tremendous thankfulness.
There's a thought. Why don't you thank the station you're listening to for carrying the Public Square, huh? All right, we'll be back. Stay with us.
We will be right back for more on the Public Square. Spreading the light of liberty across the land. Now back to the Public Square.
Let's continue the conversation today on the Public Square about the Supreme Court, this present Supreme Court. The progressive like to call it the MAGA Court. Hey, I have a question. Why do you suppose the founders didn't prescribe the number of justices to make up the Supreme Court?
Because that's Congress's responsibility to determine the size and the jurisdiction of the court. So they gave that strictly to Congress. And when they began, they thought 6 justices would be enough. And so Washington appointed 6, and they were unanimously ratified. It was the third step of establishing the republic, is to get the court in place. But you're right, Wayne. When you go to the Constitution, it doesn't say there shall be 9 or there shall be 11, which means that you probably want to take a minute and talk about court packing, don't you?
Yeah, I do. But also the idea, I mean, I serve on boards, and we try not to have an even number of people on a board so that you can, when you take a vote, sometimes there needs to be a majority. And 6 seems like an odd number to me.
Yeah, I guess it bespeaks the fact that the court's jurisdiction was understood to be so limited that they found it hard to believe that with 6 they would ever have a problem getting a majority, because the issues that would be coming to the court would be so transparent. This court was originally designed to be very limited in its jurisdiction, and mostly settling issues between the states and then some other specific places of original jurisdiction, like the question of the role of the court in regards to impeachment and other things. So no, they didn't see 6 as a problem at all.
Right. Okay. Well, it's interesting that the idea of court packing has come up once again. Was it Mark Twain who said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
FDR
Yes.
tried this court packing business, and many believe it was his greatest defeat as president.
Well, and what happened with FDR was he was bending all the rules of understanding in regards to the limits of jurisdiction of the federal government by creating many of the programs that he attempted to create that he was anticipating would help get us out of the Depression, or selling them in that way. Now, Amity Shlaes has written a great book called The Forgotten Man, in which she talks about FDR and all of this, and she's appeared on this broadcast as well. Former Wall Street Journal editorial writer and a very accomplished author. And most people that look at this with a non-jaundiced eye see that what Roosevelt was trying to do was to increase his popularity and significance, and to do something to respond to the Great Depression. Now, most people in retrospect consider that most of what Roosevelt did was helpful to some people. It didn't solve the question of the Great Depression because it never dealt with the sources and the true realities of the Great Depression. So it was therapeutic at best and not very effective, but it was very controversial because it took the federal government into places that the federal government had never been before. It, in essence, the federal government became a payroll agent and a project manager. And those matters were challenged. And what was happening is when the Republicans and others would bring Roosevelt's plans to the Supreme Court, they were getting knocked down. They were being overruled, and the programs were being canceled so frequently that Roosevelt decided the answer to this was to introduce in Congress a measure to pack the court. He was going to expand the number of justices dramatically, and by so doing, he believed that he could control the new appointees. He'd make them, he would prevail on Congress to appoint them, and then he could get his way. Now, it never ultimately happened. The resolution did not go through. Roosevelt didn't end up doing it, but the very organization of it was such a national story and such a big deal that it actually caused the court to back down. They stood down on challenging the balancing remaining measures that Roosevelt would propose for remedies to the Great Depression. In fact, it was such a popular campaign in the sense that it was talked about in newspapers and everywhere. I actually have a coin. I have a coin that actually was stamped by the committee that was opposing Roosevelt's court packing. And there was an organization out there, and it says it's got the committee, all right, for the preservation of the court, and they've got a logo and everything. It was like it was you would hand that to people. It was like a campaign button.
Wow.
Yeah,
like a challenge coin for today.
Exactly. And so it was a very big deal, and Roosevelt lost, but in losing, he got his way because the court backed down.
Okay.
So it's all about politics and policy.
But here we go again.
Here we go again. Yeah,
Here
of
we
course.
go again.
And what's been going on in recent months has been a clear political attempt on the part of Democratic leaders, particularly in the United States Senate, to discredit the Supreme Court, to discredit certain justices. The whole concept of proposing a piece of legislation on Supreme Court ethics, where the Congress suddenly Congress has discovered their authority and responsibility to the court. So they're going to propose they're going to lay an ethics law on the Supreme Court. Wow, how about that? They could pass a law and actually tell the court what to do. Funny, for 50 years in Roe versus Wade, they never discovered that authority, but it's okay. Now they suddenly have got it because the shoe's on the other foot.
Are they going to do that for the other two branches also?
And that's the thing, pass the law, because here's the deal. Then politicians have to run on those laws and what they put into place. And it's easy to offer deflect and blame to the court. It's another thing when you have to pass the law and run as part of your campaign.
So they're trying to indict in the court of public opinion certain justices that somehow they have been involved in corrupt practices, taking benefits or pay or trips or whatever. And then these court practices that are so corrupt and so aside from the body politic that we should have new ethics restrictions on the Supreme Court. It's all designed to diminish the court so that they can move forward in a more favorable way on court packing. They need to create the Supreme Court now, which for years, for generations, was the most esteemed body, the most important part of the government. As long as the court was doing what the left wanted, they revered the court. How dare you challenge the court? Now that they're not getting what they want, they're ready to bring them up on ethics violations. They're ready to pass laws to put them into traps and tricks. They're ready to impeach him. They're ready to do all kinds of stuff because they're not getting their way.
Ready to march in front of their homes.
Yeah, yes, threaten their lives. Yes. So the point is, the left is not for the republic. The left is for whatever part of the republic is working in their favor right now. There's not a sense of logical loyalty and consistency to the construct of our government. And that's a bad situation to be in. Now, you say, well, how dare these people? Well, I got to tell you, there's a little bit of Abraham Lincoln in this conversation. Anybody remember Lincoln's opinion of the Supreme Court?
Well, the Supreme Court has made it. Well, I remember Andrew Jackson saying the Supreme Court has made its decision. Let us see it enforce it.
Mm-hmm.
So did Lincoln say something similar to that?
Well, what about Lincoln with Dred Scott? One decision does not a law make.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Well, there you have it.
Yeah. Well, and he happened to be right.
Yes.
All right. So but now that's the administration directly defying the court. Okay, so maybe these professors were right.
The court can get it wrong at times. That's the other thing. The court gets it wrong, and some people aren't willing to. They want to have it the way that, they're 100% right when I agree with them, but they're 100% wrong when I don't.
When you agree with it, it's settled law. I wonder if Dred Scott was settled law. I wonder if Plessy versus Ferguson was settled law.
Right, of course not. Of course
How about Citizens United? Is that settled law?
But the key is...
I think dissenting opinions are much more interesting than the opinions.
Right.
But I don't think there is settled law.
But in addition to the dissenting, there's not settled law until Congress says the law is settled, because Congress makes the law.
Right.
And that's the point. And what Lincoln was doing was telling Congress, this can't stand. We can't, Dred Scott can't stand. Plessy Ferguson, no, we're not going to do. So Congress has to keep at it until the will of the people is represented. And they have to keep at it and keep at it and keep at it.
Do your job, right?
Yeah.
Do your job.
Do your job. Yep. All right. So there is, everyone knows something's afoot. And yes, it's going to be a 2024 election issue. And that's going to be very important. There's going to be, the Supreme Court will be an issue. They're setting all the pieces and parts in play right now. It's important to understand that what's going on in the news today is all about what's going to be happening next year. And it's important to understand that so that you see that what's as important as who becomes the next president is who becomes the next members of the Senate and the House.
As we go into the next segment, I have a question for you as it pertains to the court, as it pertains to election cycles, and as it pertains to strategy. I think there's things that people are wondering.
All right, we'll make way for that question coming up on The Public Square, online, thepublicsquare.com. Back with you on the Public Square now as we talk about the Supreme Court on this edition of the program. If you've missed recent editions, by the way, I urge you to listen. There's been some tremendous topics in the last few weeks here on the Public Square, as always, and I really encourage you to take some time, go back through the archive, and pick up on some that you may have missed. All right, Rob, you said you had a question.
Well, with the appointment of Justice Barrett at the end of the Trump administration and thinking into the future, do you think we'll see a time where there will be people that step off the court strategically when their party has control of the White House and the Senate so that someone can step in of a younger version of the political persuasion in which they choose? I mean, I'm just thinking about Justice Brown, Justice Barrett, younger folks on the court that may serve at length. Will we see people step aside for the betterment, I hate to say of their party, but of their side?
Well, that was what I was going to say. Justices aren't supposed to have a party, are they?
Oh,
not supposed to, no.
You can't say that, man. That's not loud.
I mean, am I missing something? But...
Well,
we can call it political persuasion.
we can call it worldview. We can call it ideology. But, Alan, the point that you're bringing up is something that we were talking about earlier in staff today, how difficult it is when we are trying to run a country that is a government of, by, and for the people. And yet what we're doing is we're playing games by putting everyone in a silo or, in essence, putting a jersey on everybody, and it's either red or blue, and everything comes down to one of two choices. And that is a very difficult way for people to survive. It's not the way America was designed to be. But part of this has to do with the construct of the balance of powers. We go back to what we said first. The court's supposed to be the least significant of the three branches. Now, when you elevate it to the most significant, you're already out of order. And now the justices become outsized characters. And a swing of one way or the other is basically the sense that the whole country's coming down to this. And remember, these are non-elected people. This country was not supposed to be governed by non-elected people. That's not America. That's not the way the Constitution was constructed. We've turned it into that, and much of the problem goes back to the political parties who have put forward, with the people's support, some of the most feckless characters in Congress that you can find, who don't have the courage to do anything but stand for re-election, are unwilling to have real debates. Also, the concept of having a supermajority vote for cloture, so that now people think that it's in the Constitution that you have to have 60 votes to pass anything through the Congress, which is absurd. It's not in there. That's a local rule. That's like a House monopoly rule in the Senate. And by doing it that way, they literally are paralyzing the legislative process to give more room for the courts to come in and make decisions. This government needs tuned up in some very serious places.
But all that chaos that allows the courts to step in keeps those politicians in power, and it keeps them in their job, and it keeps them living off the government dime. I mean, if we look at the length of some of the members of the House and the Senate and how they've served, that's a pretty good gig, just deflecting blame onto others.
Well, and if we go down this path much longer, we're going to begin to knock on the door once again of hopelessness. We need to always stop right as we start to see that hallway coming into play and explain something to folks. There's nothing in our worldview or our experience of 43 years in working in civil government that brings us to a place of hopelessness. We live in a fallen world. Things that are good go bad. Things that are hot turn cold. It's called entropy, or the second law of thermodynamics. We humans fall down. It's a part of it. So if your thought is, well, if it's not perfect, then it's worth nothing, you're missing the point altogether. What we're doing now is calling out a strategy that the other side is bringing forward that is not a new strategy to our country, but it's new strategy to the progressive left. They had it all going their way with the court. Now it's not going their way with the court. So the court used to be the good guys. Now the court's the bad guys. And so they're going to try to move another direction. Notice I'd have a lot I'd have to praise them if they said, the answer here is this court's out of control. We need a Congress that's going to stand against that court and continue to pass laws that we the people want. Now, that's an admirable legal, ethical, and constitutional position. But no, they said we need to have an administration that will defy the court. Now, the administration, and this did not start with Joe Biden. This is Donald Trump. This is Barack Obama. This is George W. Bush. The rising level of executive orders in the sense that the executive branch and the administrative state can arbitrarily impact and enact governmental regulations and processes without the authorization of Congress is rampant.
Well, what's I think a bigger problem is when Congress gives them a blank check, like they did with Obamacare, where they had more than 850 references in it where the executive branch could do something, shall or may.
Right. So they gave HHS a blanket blank check over, I don't even want to remember how many pages that thing was. It was 2,567 or something like that, depending on what version.
Before it was enrolled, it was 3,309 pages.
I guess she told me.
From the one who read it all the way through 8 times.
When they enroll it, it gets smaller print and wider margins, so you have fewer pages or whatever.
Who knows? All I know is that members of Congress were calling her to ask what was in the legislation, and that's a true story.
That is a fact.
Okay, so let's take an example of another issue that's been before the Supreme Court and that is actually working its way down through, and it was not a MAGA court that was involved in this. We have to go the whole way back to 1997 when the discussion about school choice, which had been around in America for a long, long time, crested over the threshold in 1997 where a handful of states, Wisconsin, Florida, Ohio, to start, were trying to implement school choice programs in their state legislative process. Now, these were experimental programs because it was something that was an idea that was not new by any stretch of the imagination, that had been tried successfully in Europe as well. But it was one of those things where we had to get this ball off the ground. So the states, becoming the laboratories of our governmental system, went ahead and got started. And in Ohio and Wisconsin and Florida, school choice laws went onto the books. Ultimately, the Supreme Court challenge turned out to be the Zellman case, which was the Ohio law. Could have been Florida, could have been Wisconsin. It ended up being the Ohio statute that was this challenge before the Supreme Court. Now, that dragged us into the fray because we helped mark up the 1997 legislation. Mm-hmm. And then the entire part of litigating that case, we were a part of from start to finish. And we had the privilege of working with some outstanding lawyers in the process and a lot of people. So it's a long, long story. It should be a book. There have been a number of books written about it and how it went back and forth. It's a dynamic story. But the case came before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court case was 1-5-4. And it was Justice O'Connor that was the deciding vote. Now, everything that we did in creating that law, helping to create that law, we didn't create it, we helped. Everything that the team that created that law put together was working under the assumption that it would be Justice O'Connor that would have the fifth and final vote. And so all of the arguments, the language, the way it was put together, it was so carefully crafted so that Justice O'Connor could say yes to that piece of legislation. And ultimately she did. So that was when the whole thing broke into the light of day. That's when school choice actually became legit, so to speak, in the sense that in fact, I remember on NBC News, that was the lead story on every news show that night.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw.
Good evening. It may be the most important ruling involving schools in America since Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education, which ended school segregation. Tonight, the U.S. Supreme Court has sanctioned school vouchers.
That was 2002. 21 years later, school choice is still unfolding across the country.
And it's being embraced in far more places because they've had a look inside the educational system and what's being taught and how it's being taught. And they're saying, wait a minute, we dismissed this to a group of folks that maybe we didn't want to, and we want to have a little bit more say of what happens. And it's nice to be able to refer back to the Zellman case because even though, as you mentioned, it happened 21 years ago, there are some people that have forgotten that case was discussed and decided.
And there have been other cases since that time where the court has continued in this trend to open more doors for school choice. And now the states have actually been doing more work. So let's go back to where the original case began in Ohio. Let's ask the question, how has school choice progressed in that state?
Well, it went from a pilot project in the city of Cleveland. Then they opened up an avenue through what's called Ed Choice vouchers. They're still vouchers, still state money being used to pay the tuition. Since then, we've had Ed Choice expansion. Now in the most recent budget, it's opened it wide up. So everyone has access to some level of a voucher in Ohio, period, now.
And I got to break in for a break. But when we come back, we've defined the issue. Let's talk about what we do now. Some of you have to leave us at this time. That's why we, as we mentioned earlier, we have the smartphone app and the Public Square website as well where you can listen. Stay with us if you can.
We will be right back for more on the Public Square.
Well, let's continue our conversation now about the Supreme Court here on the Public Square. I think it's interesting that we're having this discussion at the very moment that Israel's Knesset just voted to strip its high court of much of its power, to limit the Supreme Court's power. I don't understand fully what that means. I wish I did. I'll need to check into it more. But here's the news of the day, Israel, and it's led to great protests in the streets. The people of Israel are very upset about this.
Wayne, this is a fascinating story because it reveals a little-known fact, that Israel does not have a singular constitution. You cannot find the constitution of the nation of Israel. It does not exist. It's made up in an arrangement of documents and brokered power among the branches of their government.
So how does a court... How does that function?
Well, what's ended up happening in that sort of yet to be completed formula for government, the court has ascended into having more and more and more power. And this is now a response of the legislative branch of Israel saying, we're tired of that. And so there's a fight between the two branches of government. And of course, it shakes up a lot of people depending on where their politics are. So this is kind of the perfect example of what the framers of America did not want to happen. And it reemphasizes the critical importance of having the American Constitution, both the Declaration and the Constitution, the promise of America, the premise of America, are outlined in detail in the Declaration, and the construct of America. Then mostly the same people came together and put together the Constitution, and the states created that Constitution. And so there's a finality in the American system of government, yet still available for the amendment process to try to help make it better as time goes on and circumstance change. We are so fortunate as Americans to have a thoroughly efficient Constitution. And it's so brief and it's so small. We are very fortunate people.
Well, it's very dramatic what's taking place right now in Israel. The protests are very widespread. Water cannons are pushing people back. I mean, it's very serious.
It says there are Air Force reservists who are refusing to go into the military because of this thing.
Well, it again points out, now we have our own sets of problems here, and obviously when the Roe versus Wade decision changed, it created an amount of political protest in this country that has been still being heard. It was a tidal wave at first. Now the wave is much smaller, but that decision is still shaking up the electoral process right now in many states, and it will continue to be a key part of what happens in 2024 in regards to the elections. And that's on the highly controversial side. A little less controversial, of course, we go back to school choice, where a decision made by the Supreme Court based upon state legislation has now birthed additional opportunities with a green light clearance that now states are continuing to expand school choice in many ways.
The irony of the situation, the Supreme Court making their most recent Roe decision, is that it returned more power more closely to home to people. It put it back in the states. It gave you more access to make your voice heard about that issue.
That's a great point. It's interesting because the people that were rioting against Roe were basically rioting against being handed the opportunity to make the decision themselves.
But isn't that parallel to school choice? Because in the Supreme Court's decision, you're giving more power to parents, which is as local as you can get.
Which makes us wonder about our idea of wanting to live kind of on robot mode. It's like if someone else would just make the decisions for us and tell us what we're supposed to do, we'll just do it, and then we'll know, and we'll just move on with our lives. That's the thing to me that is the most anti-American ethos in this entire conversation. that somehow, with all of our wonderful rights that we recognize in our Constitution is given to us by God, there are no attending responsibilities.
Yeah, they're not making you do something by issuing many of the rulings. They're saying what you have the ability to do.
Yeah, we're not going to get in the way. I mean, here's a little more freedom. Now go home and pout about it, right? I mean, it's like, come on, what?
But people already liked what it was. That's why everyone feels that they were robbed. They already liked the status quo. They liked not having to do anything.
They couldn't even explain what it was, nor could they explain what it meant, but they just didn't have to deal with it, which made them happy because now we could stream more Netflix. All right, and move forward. Now, again, that sounds like I am being condescending because I got Netflix too. I can't tell you that I can in any way, shape, or form say that I've even begun to meet my civic responsibilities for this country, for what we were handed and what the opportunity is for our children and grandchildren. I can't, if I live to 200, critics are saying, oh, God forbid. If I lived to 200, I still would have a debt to owe that I couldn't repay because of what we've been given and what we've been handed. But as is true in every circumstance of every human relationship, we take it for granted. We take the people we love the most for granted. We take the things that mean the most for granted. You hop in your car, you drive your car because you always drive, but excuse me, did we check the oil? All right. Do we know what the next maintenance schedule is? We take things that work for granted.
And we see that in some of the policies that are put in place because they are so short-sighted. We don't look at the long-term ramifications. We don't look at what may happen. We need to sit around a table, pull on every thread, and say, is this the best decision? The Constitution wasn't formed without asking those tough questions. You can tell the intent that was put into it by the words that were put on the paper.
Well, and the other thing that's in our way is the political parties. Because I can tell you from having been on the ground, as we all were with school choice, that to get school choice through the legislative process, to get it through state courts with 3 state court appearances. You started in the county court, you went to the appellate court, then you went to the state Supreme Court. Then it started all over again in the district court, in the circuit court, and finally the United States Supreme Court. So we had 6 different courtrooms we were in. I can tell you along the way in that process, there were a whole lot of Democrats who were completely committed to school choice. There were Democrat legislators, Democrat litigators, Democrat parents, Democrat kids. There were all kinds of Democrats and Republicans and a whole lot of independents. This was a cross-cultural, cross-socioeconomic, cross-religious lines. There were a lot of people who said, this needs to happen. It really needs to happen. And so that there are issues that supersede political parties, and that's why the partisanship around the court debate is so dangerous. The idea of the reason that Supreme Court justices are appointed for life is what? We can't find, we've got 9 out of 336 million. We can't find a 10th one. We've got 9, we got to hold on to them until they die. No. The idea is you're appointed for life because you don't have to be a partisan anymore. Because partisanship should no longer matter. You're not running for office. Your salary is established by the Congress. You can't campaign for more pay. You take this on as a mission for life to try to discern what is the right thing according to the rule of law. That's your job. And it is a very difficult job. I know when we went before the United States Supreme Court on school choice, the thing that gave me the greatest amount of comfort was in those oral arguments. I actually knew, because we knew this, we had to know this issue. We trained with some of the best lawyers in the world. And when I knew that they knew what we knew. And boy, was that ever encouraging, because it was the first courtroom I was in that I actually believed that the people sitting on the bench knew what we were talking about and could make it clear that they could tell us what they were talking about. They were brilliant. Even the ones who hated the idea altogether, they asked the right questions. They asked intelligent questions. They were brilliant.
And that's all you ask, right?
That's all you ask for is your day in court. Just give us the day. And we know what? We got the day. Thanks be to God we prevailed, because now thousands and thousands of lives are being changed. Now, we still got a problem with school choice. It's growing. The interest is growing. The courts are continuing to see the logic of what's happening. Problem is we don't have enough capacity. There's still not enough seats. 20 years later, we've got programs like in Ohio where it's kind of almost getting to the place of universal school choice, where parents are given the opportunity to redirect their dollars for their kids. There's not enough seats. We need to enter an era now of building alternative schools to give people the opportunity were to take their own tax dollars and put those kids in school if that's what they so choose.
And right there, I'm going to break in, and we'll have to wrap up this week's edition of The Public Square. Of course, there are other editions of this program that you'll find on many radio stations and online as well. There's a daily version. There's a 2-minute version. Check us out at thepublicsquare.com. I'm Wayne Shepherd with Dave Zanotti, Rob Walgate, Melanie Elsey, Jeff Sanders, Alan C. Duncan. Thank you all for a great conversation today. Have you thought to share this program with others? Perhaps you learned some things today that you think others might benefit from as well. Why don't you share the link online and in conversation as well? The Public Square. Thanks for listening.
The Public Square is a broadcast service of the American Policy Roundtable.